For those of you who are unfamiliar with roller coaster terminology, a hypercoaster is a full-circuit roller coaster standing anywhere between 200 and 299 feet tall. This can also be true for coasters built into unique terrain if their lowest point and highest point differ by 200 feet. Plus, if a roller coaster has a drop of 200 feet but isn't quite 200 feet in general, then I'll happily accept that also. Some other rules that are generally agreed upon is that it can't have a launch to be considered a hypercoaster, nor can it be any style of coaster that isn't a sit-down. So no dive coasters because those have floorless trains, no inverts because those are suspended beneath the track, and no Winger 4D coasters either. Now, before we dive into the top 10 list, it may be important to realize that this list only consists of hypers that I have personally ridden. The reason I'm making this list now is because I plan to look back on it and update it once I've ridden more hypers in the future. One more thing before we get started, if you haven't done so already, I would really appreciate it if you could like the video and consider subscribing to the channel. But other than that, I hope you all enjoyed the video, and these are my top 10 hypercoasters I've ridden as of April 2021. Before touching on the number 10 spot, here are the 4 hypercoasters I've ridden that couldn't quite make the top 10. And honestly, even these are fun rides to me, which speaks volumes about this specific type of coaster. The 4 rides are Steel Force at Dorney Park, Titan at Six Flags Over Texas, Goliath at Six Flags Magic Mountain, and the Big Apple Coaster in Las Vegas. As for the actual number 10 spot, I'm passing it over to Nitro at Six Flags Great Adventure. This ride may be the lowest ranked B&M hyper on this list, but I still think it's an awesome ride. Yes, it's bipolar in terms of how it runs, but if you catch it on a good day, you're really in for a great time. Some good floater, fast speeds, and a couple intense elements really make it a must-ride attraction for when you get around to this park. I can't wait to check out Nitro again later this year. Number 9, Magnum XL200 at Cedar Point. I'd argue that Nitro is a far more complete ride than Magnum in terms of layout, but where Magnum lacks a good first half, it surely makes up for in an incredible second half. That entire return run, to me, really makes this ride shine, and without it, it definitely would not be making this list. I should reiterate that I find this coaster outrageously overrated, considering that some people rank it as a top 3 or even top 2 ride in the park. I personally have it outside of the top 5, but don't click off of the video just yet. I do like the ride, and I am looking forward to some more Magic Seat rides in the future. Number 8, Steel Eel at SeaWorld San Antonio. This ride is one of those rare cases of a hypercoaster that isn't 200 feet tall, nor does it have a drop of 200 feet tall. Instead, it actually tops out at 150 feet, so you may be asking, why did it make this list? While I know many will simply consider it a mega coaster, I decided to put it on this list because it follows a very similar layout to other Morgan hypercoasters. Yes, the ones over 200 feet. But funny enough, this one is better than all of the others in the country in my opinion. The reason I can say that is because I've ridden Steel Force at Dorney Park, but also Mamba at Worlds of Fun is a clone of that ride, and Wild Thing, well, we just don't talk about Wild Thing. But considering I've gone this long without actually talking about why Steel Eel is so great, allow me to give a brief overview. Steel Eel is absolutely loaded with airtime hills, many of which deliver abrupt moments that slam you into your seat. Plus, it's very smooth in a different kind of way, and the color scheme is stunning. I know that's not a lot of reasons, but the airtime is really so good that I'm more than happy featuring on this list. If you don't get what I mean, then check it out yourself, get out to this underrated park, and ride Steel Eel. Number 7, Cannibal at Lagoon. While this isn't your conventional hypercoaster, it does stand above 200 feet and it is a sit-down coaster, so of course it makes this list. I'm sure many of you know about this ride for one specific element, and yes, let me just say it right now, the drop kicks ass. But even outside of that, so many of these elements are super unique. The stretched out Immelman and compact dive loop are really fun, and that lagoon roll is unique to this coaster only, which is also pretty cool. Seriously, it's such a fun ride, and I'm certainly missing the 26 rides I got right about now. Number 6, Candemonium at Hersheypark. As we get into the wave of B&M hypercoasters, Candemonium will start us off as the newest one in the US. To me personally, this is just a rock-solid hypercoaster. Does just about everything right for its respective model. You've got your floater airtime, your high speed, your unique elements, and an overall solid ride time. I'll admit that it does very little exceptionally well, but like I said, this is just a very well-rounded coaster. I'd also argue that it was the perfect fit for this park, even though they already had a hypercoaster before this. I find that the floater airtime found on Candymonium serves as a great contrast to Skyrush's ejector, which is why I highly approve of the park's newest addition. Number 5, Mako at SeaWorld Orlando. Even if this ride has some lesser impressive stats considering its model, many, including myself, think it's one of the top dog B&M hypers around.
If you look back about what I said about Candemonium, everything I said there can also apply here, but I'd actually say Mako does a better job standing out. It's a very imposing ride as you're driving in with its purple color scheme and massive camelbacks. And speaking of the camelbacks, this ride's hills have some of the best floater in the entire world. The first one that takes place, and the one that everyone always raves about, is undeniably a highlight. I'd even argue that it's the most sustained floater moment I've ever experienced. Plus, Mako is super smooth, has phenomenal restraints, and has some great musical scores that play as you elevate up the lift hill. Currently, this is my favorite coaster in the state of Florida, so no doubt you can count me in for some re-rides this coming June. Number 4, Behemoth at Canada's Wonderland. As unpopular as this opinion may be, I do believe that Behemoth is slightly superior to Mako, primarily because of its layout. Trust me, I absolutely love Mako's first half, but everything post-mid-course on that ride is really lackluster in my opinion. Meanwhile on Behemoth, you got a couple of fun helixes and floater hills making up the second half of the ride. Likewise, the first half is also just as good as Mako's, with a similar setting above the water and a barrage of massive floater-filled camelbacks. Behemoth does fall flat in terms of soundtracks because it literally doesn't have one, but everything else about it is just as good, if not superior to Mako's elements. Number 3, Phantom's Revenge at Kennywood. As we wrap up the B&Ms, let's head back over to Morgan for what is one heck of a ride. Before we talk about what makes Phantom's Revenge so good, I'd like to start with some minor complaints. First of all, I find that the layout is quite inconsistent in a way where the first half is void of any airtime and the second half is loaded with it. Yes, this could have easily been avoided if you put a speed hill where there's straight track and made that monstrous drop into the ravine a bit steeper. Also, call me crazy, but I actually find this ride to be a bit too smooth. I know that's not your typical nitpick, but to me, it means that this ride doesn't really have a bite to it. If you look at something like Skyrush at Hersheypark, which is in that perfect middle ground of smooth and rough, that's honestly what I'd love to see integrated on this ride. But now that I've touched in on the negatives, I have to give you guys an explanation of why this cracks my top 3. Let me start off by saying, damn, that second half is freaking nuts. Every single hill in that portion of the ride provides some of the wildest, most ridiculous ejector airtime in the world. Literally, that alone is enough of a reason, and I'm sure those of you who have ridden this coaster know exactly what I'm talking about. It may be a bit hard to see if you haven't experienced this ride, but seriously, those elements shape this ride into what makes it so incredibly good. Number 2, Skyrush at Hersheypark. Taking a jump up in quality from Phantoms, I'd debatably call this ride my favorite coaster in the entire world depending on the day. Thus, I find this to be a perfect 10 out of 10 roller coaster even with those notorious restraints. I for one have never been bothered by them, but even if you are, how could you let that take away from this crazy airtime, these insane laterals, and these bone-crushing positives? For those of you who haven't had the luxury of experiencing this coaster, I swear that this is one of those rides that rides a whole heck of a lot crazier than it looks. The drop, for example, doesn't look anything too extraordinary from Offride, but actually riding it makes it the best drop I've ever experienced on a coaster. But don't take my word for it, I urge you all to take the trip out to Hersheypark and try it out yourself. I cannot recommend this ride enough if you are into the most thrilling of roller coasters. Number 1, Steel Vengeance at Cedar Point. You can't tell me that this was a surprise. Steel Vengeance usually ends up topping any list it's eligible to be in. In this case, it may not be anything like the other hypers, but you tell me, is it a full circuit roller coaster with a sit-down train that stands between 200 and 299 feet? Exactly, and truthfully, that's all there is to it. Now let's talk about why this comes in at the top spot. In my eyes, the hype is still met with every single ride on this coaster. My first experience with it came in 2019 with 9 rides split between 2 consecutive days. Then I came back in 2020 after making the impulsive decision to drive 12 additional hours for just one day at the park. Believe me when I say it was worth it, partially because I was able to walk away with a couple more rides on what is currently the best coaster I've ever ridden. Yes, I'm talking about Steel Vengeance. Did you really think I'd be talking about any other ride right now? That wouldn't even make sense. Anyways, I had to bring this up to say that every single ride I've ever gotten on Steel Vengeance has been just as good as the last. It's always been number 1 material for me across the dozen rides I've had on it, and thus I have no problem putting it as the best hypercoaster on this entire list. Thank you all so much for watching today's video. I hope you enjoyed it and learned a couple things about my favorite hypercoasters. For those of you who made it to the end of the video, I'd love to hear down in the comments what your favorite hypercoasters are. But other than that, I hope you enjoyed once again, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye guys.